Why do you want to be executed?
I have to be.
Could you tell me what a good way is to die?
Brewer says he took part in the assault on Byrd, but had nothing to do with the killing as far as driving the truck.
When prisoners ask for something in their final moments, it usually gets granted. But what happens when some of these inmates decide to make disturbing or unusual requests? From a notorious serial killer's casual meal to a death row inmate's religious conversion, here are some of the most unsettling final wishes of prisoners before their execution. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was a notorious serial killer responsible for the murders of 33 young men and boys. His crimes were particularly horrifying because he often lured his victims by pretending to be a friendly figure in the community. Many of the bodies were found buried under his own house. Gacy's final moments before his execution in 1994 by lethal injection were strange and disturbing. His last meal request was for fried chicken, fried shrimp, French fries, strawberries, and a Diet Coke. This meal choice was notable because Gacy had once worked as a manager at a KFC restaurant, and many believed he was making a final mockery of the serious nature of his punishment by enjoying food that had been part of his regular life. The request also seemed strange because it was as if he was treating his last meal as something casual, even though he was about to be executed for horrifying crimes. When reporters and officials asked Gacy about his thoughts on his execution, his final words were even more disturbing. He simply said, "Kiss my A's." This lack of remorse made his final moments unsettling for many. He didn't acknowledge the pain and suffering he had caused to his victims' families and seemed to show no regret at all for the brutal murders he committed. Instead of offering an apology or expressing sorrow, Gacy remained defiant and indifferent until the very end. James Edward Smith. James Edward Smith was a convicted murderer executed in Texas in 1990. Smith's crime involved the fatal shooting of a man during a robbery attempt in Houston in 1983. His case drew attention not only for the crime itself, but for his peculiar request before his execution. Most inmates on death row request elaborate meals, but Smith's last wish was unlike any other. He asked for a lump of dirt instead of food. This request wasn't random. Smith had practiced voodoo and believed that the dirt would be used in a ritual that would allow his spirit to pass on safely to the afterlife. Smith's request for dirt was denied by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The officials claimed that dirt wasn't an acceptable last meal request. Instead, they offered Smith yogurt, which he declined. The fact that Smith wanted to perform a voodoo ritual instead of indulging in a final meal added an eerie dimension to his final moments. It highlighted his deeply held beliefs and how he viewed death differently from most people. Unlike other inmates who might use their last moments to reflect or repent, Smith's last wish was rooted in his spiritual practices. The denial of his request raised questions about the rights of prisoners to practice their religion in their final moments. Although his crime was violent, his last wish revealed a side of him that was more complex and spiritual. Lawrence Russell Brewer. Lawrence Russell Brewer was one of the 3 men convicted for the brutal killing of James Byrd Jr. in 1998. Brewer, along with 2 other white supremacists, chained Byrd, an African-American man, to the back of a truck and dragged him for miles along a rural road in Jasper, Texas. The crime was so horrific that it shocked the entire nation and led to hate crime, legislation being strengthened in the United States. Brewer's role in the murder was clear, and he was sentenced to death for his part in the killing. Brewer's last meal request before his execution in 2011 stirred further controversy. He asked for an extravagant meal that included 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, fried okra, a pound of barbecued meat, half a loaf of bread, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts. However, when the meal was brought to him, Brewer didn't eat any of it. This wasteful request angered many, especially because his crime had already left such a deep scar on society. In response to Brewer's actions, Texas made the decision to end the tradition of allowing inmates to choose their last meal. From that point onward, death row inmates in Texas would receive the same meal as any other prisoner. Brewer's final act, in which he ordered a massive amount of food and refused to eat it, was seen as a further sign of his disregard for the pain and suffering he had caused. Eric Davila's story is not as well known as some other death row inmates, but his final moments were just as chilling. Eric Davila. Davila was convicted of the murder of a young woman during a robbery. His violent act led to his capture and eventual sentencing to death. What set Davila apart was his final meal request and the way he approached his execution. Unlike many inmates who either request comfort food or something extravagant, Davila's request was surprisingly simple. He asked for only a single apple, which he ate quietly in his cell before being led to the execution chamber. This humble request gave insight into Davila's mindset in his final moments. He wasn't interested in indulging himself or making a statement with his last meal. The simplicity of his choice stood in stark contrast to the violence of his crime. There was no spectacle, no attempt to draw attention, just a quiet acceptance of what was to come. For some, this simplicity made his final moments more disturbing, as it left an eerie calm before his death. It was almost as if he had come to peace with his fate in a way that others on death row had not. In his final statement, Davila did not express much remorse or talk about the crime he committed. He only mentioned that he was ready to go and hoped that his execution would bring peace to the victim's family. The contrast between his violent act and his calm demeanor before death left many who followed his case with a sense of unease, as if they were witnessing two completely different sides of a person. Michel Ney. Michel Ney was convicted for the murder of a police officer during a botched robbery. His crime was violent and left a trail of grief in its wake. Before his execution, Ney had one final wish that caught the attention of many. Instead of asking for a traditional meal, he requested a communion wafer. Ney had found religion while on death row, and his request for a wafer was part of a final religious ritual he wanted to perform before his death. Ney's request for a communion wafer stood out because it represented a spiritual act rather than a physical indulgence. The wafer symbolized his belief in forgiveness and redemption. It was his way of expressing his faith and his hope that he could be forgiven for the terrible crime he had committed. His request was granted, and Ney was allowed to perform the communion rite before his execution. Many found Ney's final moments unsettling, not because of the wafer itself, but because of the contrast between his newfound religious conviction and the brutal nature of his crime. His last request was an attempt to seek peace in his final moments, but it also raised questions about the sincerity of death row inmates who find religion while awaiting execution. While some believed Ney was genuinely repentant, others saw his final act as a desperate attempt to find comfort in the face of death. Philip Workman. Philip Workman was executed in Tennessee in 2007 for the murder of a police officer during a robbery in 1981. Unlike other inmates, Workman's last request wasn't about satisfying a personal craving or religious ritual. Instead, Workman made a request that surprised many. He asked that his last meal be donated to a homeless person. Workman's act was seen as an attempt to do something good in his final moments, even though he was being put to death for a violent crime. His request wasn't granted by prison officials, as the rules didn't allow such donations, but it still made an impact. In response to Workman's denied request, some people in Tennessee and other parts of the country decided to donate meals to the homeless in his honor. This act of kindness created a small but meaningful movement where people tried to turn Workman's final wish into something positive. For many, Workman's request was a sign that he was trying to make amends for the life he had taken, even though he would never be able to undo the damage caused by his crime. Workman's final wish was seen as an attempt to leave behind a different legacy, one that wasn't defined solely by the violent act he committed. His choice to use his last moments to think of others, rather than himself, made his execution stand out from the others. Frank Atwood. Frank Atwood was sentenced to death for the abduction and murder of an 8-year-old girl in Arizona in 1984. His crime was one of the most horrifying and left a deep impact on the community. Atwood spent decades on death row, appealing his case multiple times, but ultimately, he was executed in 2022. Before his death, Atwood made a last request that reflected his religious beliefs. He had converted to Greek Orthodoxy while in prison, and his final meal request was tied to his faith. He asked for a vegan meal that followed the dietary rules of his religion. Atwood's request was granted, and he was given a vegan meal in accordance with his Orthodox Christian faith. His religious transformation while on death row was something that he took seriously, and his final meal reflected his commitment to his beliefs. In his final moments, Atwood expressed remorse for the pain he had caused and asked for forgiveness from the victim's family. Some believed that he had truly changed, while others felt that his conversion was a way to cope with the fear of death. Regardless of how people viewed his final actions, Atwood's last request for a religiously appropriate meal and his final words of remorse added a layer of complexity to his execution. And that's it for today's episode. Don't forget to leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and ring that notification bell while you're down there.